This video is brought to you by Massdrop, an online store where you can purchase products such as a Sennheiser PC37X gaming headset. Nothing's in it. The 1-inch of velvet padding and above average mic lets you game by yourself or with friends online for hours in comfort. Personally for me, the best part about them is how they can be used for both PC gaming and editing or watching videos. The 37X has sold over 13,000 units with a near perfect review score, so why not get in on the fun? The link to check out these headphones will be in the description. Aside from that, it's finally time to open Pandora's box and talk about the most controversial aspect of Breath of the Wild: the timeline placement. We all know of the long debate of where Breath of the Wild falls under, and while Aonuma had previously stated in an interview that the placement was up to the player's imagination, nothing official was ever said. So it's not too shocking that they would end up putting the game under all three splits in the timeline. What I want to address first is that just because it falls under each split, that does not automatically mean that the timelines converge. You can have Breath of the Wild take place in all three timelines, but not through a merging, and that reasoning will be further explained later on in this video. Today we'll be going over a variety of evidence used to place the game in each timeline, including a very brief look at Game Theory's older video regarding the timeline placement. After that is done, I'll further explain how all splits could end with Breath of the Wild, as well as Nintendo's secret reasons for doing so. Because I wanted to get as much information as possible regarding evidence for each timeline, I made sure to look at my share of videos on the topic. I recommend watching these, as some go in more detail than mine. The links to all these videos will be down in the description. Now, because this game is so massive, as you'd expect, there is a lot to look at in terms of evidence. From characters, enemies, geography, and even the story itself. Even the information presented to us from Aonuma at the time hadn't really helped with Breath's definitive placement. All we knew was that the game took place after Ocarina of Time, and that whatever split it fell under, it was at the very end. Early in the game's launch, however, players were able to find the very first clue to the timeline placement, an item that could be found by breaking ore that was referred to as rock salt. The description for this item read, "Crystallized salt from the ancient sea." As expected, many people believed that this ancient sea was a reference to the Great Sea in Wind Waker. Because this game fell under the adult timeline, a pretty strong case was made for Breath of the Wild taking place sometime after the Wind Waker. However, the one problem is that this could have also been referencing the ancient sea from Skyward Sword in the Lanayru province, as Fi briefly talks about the Sand Sea once being full of water. And since Skyward Sword happens before the split, it doesn't make the previous salt claim as rock solid. After that, it was all about looking deeper into the content found within Breath of the Wild and making some connections to certain splits in the timeline. But the issue with most videos is that while you can use evidence to prove the game's placement in one specific area, there was either no evidence disproving the possibility of it happening in the other two, or similar evidence could be found to put it in the other splits. That's one of the biggest problems with both MatPat's video and many others. And since Game Theory has a massive influence on the Zelda community, I'm going to look at some of the arguments made in this video to show how Breath of the Wild could appear in the Fallen, Child, and Adult. First off, let's talk about enemies. As stated in Game Theory's video, the Lynels do only appear in games that fall under the hero is defeated timeline, so their inclusion in Breath of the Wild would point it towards being the same split. But then there are other enemies that contradict this claim. For example, Chuchus, Lizalfos, and Bokoblins all appear in both the Child and Adult timelines, but never in Fallen. So either looking at enemies isn't a reliable piece of evidence, or it's further proof that the game falls under all three. This logic also applies to certain landmarks found within the game. In the Great Hyrule Forest, locations such as Mido Swamp, Lake Saria, and Rauru Hillside all reference Ocarina of Time, which is to be expected. But to the side of the Lost Woods and Korok Forest, there is Mekar Island. This once again references Wind Waker, adding validity to the adult timeline. But Arbiter's Ground can also be found within the Gerudo Desert, and only appears in one other game, Twilight Princess, which falls under the Child timeline. Same with areas like Lanayru, Eldin, and Faron. All can be found in 3 games, Skyward Sword, Breath of the Wild, and, you guessed it, Twilight Princess. Breath of the Wild also has 2 bridges that can connect it to the previously mentioned game. The Bridge of Hylia is very similar in name to Twilight Princess's Great Bridge of Hylia, and both have the Bridge of Eldin. One interesting structure can also be found within Faron's region. At the Palmyra Ruins, if the player completes a side quest called A Fragmented Monument, it results in the restoration of a structure with a similar shape to the Mirror of Twilight. However, upon closer inspection, both the monument and the mirror have no similar physical features other than the same shape, so both are most likely not connected. Structures such as the Temple of Time and Lon Lon Ranch closely resemble those found in Ocarina of Time, which isn't very surprising, but the latter makes the idea of the game occurring occurring in the adult split a lot less likely. With both the passage of time and being submerged in water, the wood probably wouldn't be left standing. Credit to HMK for that valid argument. And to add to the evidence disproving the adult timeline, the settlement known for inhabiting the long-lost Chica tribe, Kakariko Village, appears in games from both the Fallen and Child timeline splits, but never in the adult. Of course, considering how scarce they are in other Zelda games, it's hard to believe that Breath of the Wild could fall in any of the 3 timelines, as the Sheikah are shown to be thriving in the village. Hyrule Castle itself has a lot of similarities to the castle found in Twilight Princess, but another big piece of evidence pointing towards the Child timeline is found in Goron City. Within the settlement, there are Goron statues carved right off of the face of the mountain. These resemble 3 Gorons found in the games: Daruk from Breath of the Wild, Darunia from Ocarina of Time, and Gor Koron, who is one of the 4 Goron elders in Twilight Princess. Inspecting the statue at a closer distance confirms this, as the facial hairstyles match. But one of the most iconic landforms, Spectacle Rock, is found in Breath of the Wild around the Gerudo Desert. This structure has been seen in a variety of Zelda games, with one of the most similar being found in A Link to the Past. Others have claimed it to exist in games such as Ocarina of Time, but with much less similarity. What's interesting though is that this landform has almost always been around Death Mountain, while Breath of the Wild is in a different location altogether. In fact, Eldin as a region is quite far from the Gerudo Wasteland. Certain characters within the game have also striked conversation and debate between fans and theorists on the timeline placement. The Deku Tree only appears in the adult timeline, and Koroks are only found in one other game, the Wind Waker. If that isn't enough for you, they have the exact same design as Breath of the Wild. If the argument about Lynel's only being found in the Fallen timeline is valid, then this also holds ground. But what about Calamity Ganon? Well, first of all, as mentioned already by MatPat, the Fallen timeline is the only one where Ganondorf's iconic Gerudo form doesn't appear. This is because he transforms into his demonic beast form after obtaining the full Triforce in Ocarina of Time. But once again, we see not one, but 2 references to Twilight Princess. First of all, Calamity Ganon's head is extremely similar in design to Ganondorf's skull, with the gem and everything. And the Hatred and Malice Incarnate, aka Dark Beast Ganon, also is similar to the Dark Beast Ganon in Twilight Princess. Man, Twilight Princess is referenced a lot in this game, isn't it? Oh yeah, and speaking of references to older games, when you talk to Shimei at the Woodland Stable, she talks about the land in the sky and riding a really big bird. Obviously this references Skyward Sword, but adds nothing to the placement theory. I just thought it was interesting. But something that does add to this theory can be found in Zora's Domain. There are a total of 10 monuments scattered throughout the region, and out of all of them, one gives us useful information about Hyrule's past. Long, long ago, in a past more distant than even the Great Calamity or the creation of Divine Beast Varuta, there was a Zora princess named Ruto. We know that she was an attendant to the Zora patron deity and that she was a fair and lively girl, beloved to all. Around that same time, an evil man with designs on ruling the world appeared, bringing disaster upon Zora's domain. It is said that Ruto then awoke as a sage, facing this foe alongside the Princess of Hyrule and the hero of legend. Her achievements are remembered not only by the Zora, they are also forever etched into the history of Hyrule. The divine beast Varuta, built ages later to face off against Calamity Ganon, was named in honor of Ruto. As we know, Ruto is awakened as a sage in both the Fallen and Adult timelines. The former when the hero is defeated and Ganon is sealed away, and the latter being similar, but the hero ends up being victorious. But the use of "it is said" also implies that the story of her awakening as a sage was fiction, allowing Breath of the Wild to still fall under the child timeline. But what about the memories? Well, there isn't much to help us. At most, people took notice to Zelda's speech during the first memory, Subdued Ceremony. In it, she says,
"Whether skyward bound, adrift in time, or steeped in the glowing embers of twilight."
Obviously this is referencing Skyward Sword, Ocarina of Time, and Twilight Princess. And this did seem like some valid evidence towards a child split, but there is a small part of this cutscene where Zelda is speaking in the background. After looking online, it was revealed that this bit referenced both A Link to the Past and The Wind Waker. Since this was translated by fans online, each result was slightly different, but the general consensus was that Zelda was referencing both of these games, and because they fall under the other two timelines, this argument for the child placement became irrelevant. And this all brings us to the last argument I want to quickly address, and that's the yellow strap mentioned by the game theorists. There are many times in the game that Nintendo references the original, from the way the game starts all the way to the official artwork. In fact, from what I've seen, the 13 heart requirement to wield the Master Sword could be a reference to the original, since 12 heart containers were needed to obtain the magical sword. Breath of the Wild is simply paying homage to the original game, so I think the addition of the strap to the Tunic of the Wild is just to reference the first game. Also, there already is an amiibo outfit for the classic Link when you use the 8-bit amiibo. And this all brings us to the main point that is trying to be made, and that's that Breath of the Wild is the inevitable outcome of all timelines. Basically meaning that no matter what happens in the 3 timelines, it always ends with the events of the Great Calamity and Link's awakening from the Shrine of Resurrection. A lot of this can actually be explained in the game's story. To begin with, we know that the time difference between the Sheikah's technological advancements and the Great Calamity is 10,000 years. With this much time passing, previous events would not affect Breath of the Wild. Some dialogue throughout the story can also help us. First of all, when Impa tells us of the legend 10,000 years ago, she says,
"With the passage of time, each conflict with Ganon faded into legend."
The use of each conflict with Ganon tells us that whatever timeline Breath of the Wild falls under, there has been at least more than one encounter with Ganon. And each split confirms this, as he returns prior to the Wind Waker, resulting in the Great Flood and then once more being defeated by the Hero of the Winds. And within the child, he is defeated in Twilight Princess, then reincarnated later in Four Swords Adventures. And as previously mentioned, Ganon appears repeatedly in his beast form in the Fallen Timeline. Adding his appearance in Ocarina of Time, as well as during Impa's story of 10,000 years ago, is more than enough to make Breath of the Wild fall under any one timeline. Second point is the fact that each conflict fades into legend. This obviously makes sense because of the long period of time between each games, but it gets more interesting with a quote from Rome boss Faramis Hyrule.
Stories of Ganon were passed from generation to generation, in the form of legends and fairy tales.
This hypothetically means that Breath of the Wild could take place in one of the 3 splits when the evidence from the other 2 are simply made-up legends of the ancient evil. In fact, there are many times where Ganon is just referred to as an evil, and everyone's perspective of this evil would be different, hence why an item such as Majora's Mask could exist in the Adult and Fallen timeline. Someone's interpretation of that evil was to the likes of Majora. Yeah, amiibo generally don't count, but this idea makes it a possible explanation. Plus, in a rather old video, I talked about the idea that the Leviathan side quest was a direct parallel to the timeline debate, as all theories on their extinctions are proved to be possible, similar to the current situation with Breath of the Wild's official placement. But one thing I do want to address is a claim I made in that exact video. I talked about how each timeline has an equal amount of evidence for Breath of the Wild to fall under it. Honestly though, after doing research for this video, it's pretty clear that while Fallen and Child are very likely, Adult seems to fall short in terms of evidence. And one of the main reasons for this is the way each timeline sets up its events. When it comes to the story, Fallen seems to be the most likely, as in the last game of that timeline, The Adventure of Link, the full Triforce is restored to the royal family of Hyrule. And in Breath of the Wild, it is implied that Zelda may have this relic to her disposal as seen on the tapestry and her use of sealing power. In Twilight Princess, the symbols of the Triforce appear on Link, Zelda, and Ganondorf's hands. And when the evil king is defeated, he appears to lose his peace. While we don't know where it went, it could have gone back to the Sacred Realm or in the possession of the royal family. But the Adult timeline is a strange one, as the king uses the Triforce to wash Ganon and Hyrule away. Eventually, a new land is found within Spirit Tracks referred to as New Hyrule. It's unknown what happens to the relic, as it isn't mentioned but still appears on Zelda's dress. What's interesting though is that how in A Link to the Past and Twilight Princess, once Ganon is defeated, the sword is put back in its pedestal where it was found. Since this is the last time it was seen in both timelines and it appears within the Korok Forest in Breath of the Wild, it solidifies both the Fallen and Child placements. But in the Wind Waker, the Master Sword isn't returned to its pedestal and is washed away with Ganon. In that case, how could it appear later on in the timeline? But while this is all true, it means that if someone were to once again obtain the Triforce, they could theoretically undo everything that was done. I highly doubt the Triforce destroyed itself upon the king's wish, so Breath of the Wild could still happen in the Adult timeline under the right circumstances. Either way, I hope Nintendo eventually gives us the reasoning for it so it makes at least a bit more sense. And this all brings up a good question. Why? Why would Nintendo place the game at the end of all 3 timelines? We've known for quite a bit that Onuma's intentions were to leave it up to the player's imagination. Well, I believe it is their effort to fix the timeline, but that will all have to wait for the next video. Make sure to stay tuned for the second part of this theory as we go over Nintendo's secret plans to fix the Zelda series as a whole and how Breath of the Wild may very well be the end of the cycle. In the meantime, make sure to like this video if you enjoyed, and if you want to be notified when the next video arrives, then make sure to subscribe and click that bell icon. As always, I have been Nintendo Black Cryonis, and I will see you guys later.